This part of the tutorial will be in Photoshop, so if you haven't used Photoshop before, let's open it up and try out a few things. This demo will specifically be talking about photo editing in Photoshop. Photoshop is definitely the most powerful Adobe software, and there is literally no limit on the amount of stuff you can do in it. So I recommend you get to know more of it in your own time. You definitely will learn more as you make more stuff in the coming years. So this really will be a beginner's guide. There are a lot of similarities between Illustrator and Photoshop, so a lot of the same principles will apply. We're going to start by creating a new document, and we're just going to make this 1920 by 1080, which is a commonly used screen size, and then we're going to make this 300 dpi. I'm going to go ahead and change this to CMYK because we're going to be printing it eventually, and I'm just going to make the background white. It doesn't really matter what you choose, you can always change it. And the other stuff, there's color spaces, but I would just leave it at whatever your default is and hit create. After we've created our file, I'm going to open up my Finder again and drag an image into our workspace. You can click the check mark on top to complete the import. Like Illustrator, you can also drag the image into the Photoshop icon and it will open up in a new tab. There are a number of benefits to opening up the image in an already created file, the biggest one being that it is much easier to see the size of the image. You already know how big the document is, so you can see if the image is high quality enough for the document. You could very easily create a document the size of like your postcard for say, and size your image within that boundary. That way you know for sure that when you go and print it out, it will fit. Also, if your document is quite large, you can place your image in it and see if it's too pixelated for the size of the document. Okay, so let's get started with some photo editing tips. I'm going to go back to our file where we placed the image directly in and not on a file. The first thing we're going to do is go to the left-hand side and choose the crop tool, or C as the shortcut. Like the name of the tool suggests, you can use this to crop the image and cut off excess parts of it that you don't want. On the top left, there are settings where you can set a ratio that you want to cut the image to. I'm going to select a square, so whenever I move or resize the crop, it will automatically be locked as a square. If you no longer want this cropping ratio, you can hit clear right next to the ratios. Next to that clear, there is a little ruler icon. This straightens your image, so you can follow lines like, for example, a horizon line in your image to straighten the image's crop to that. Our image doesn't have any straight lines, so sorry. Next, you can hit the check mark, and that just confirms the crop. Just like in Illustrator, the layer panel allows you to control layers. Currently, you can see that our only existing layer is the background layer, and there's a little lock on the right side. This means that if we use our transform tool, or V for the shortcut, we will get a warning like this that warns us that we can't move the image unless we convert it into a normal layer. The normal layer is free to move around, unlike the background layer. And now when we move the layer around, we can see a checkered pattern behind it. The checkered pattern is simply a transparency, so for example, when you create a blank new layer, it will show up as a checkered pattern. So like we talked about before, Photoshop is a pixel-based software, which means that changes can be destructive. That means, for example, if we used our brush tool and we just drew on our photo layer, the pixels on the photo layer are actually being changed. If you make too many changes away from this, you won't actually be able to undo it. Unlike Illustrator, you can't just select the line you've drawn, and if you use the erase tool, it will actually erase all of the pixels, not just the line that you drew. So because we actually didn't make that many changes, I'm just going to undo and go back to where we started from. So there are many things you can do with photo editing in Photoshop, but sizing and resizing your images is probably something we should talk about first. So we're just going to go up to Image and then Image Size. This opens up a window that allows you to resize your images. This basically means that you can either make your images super large and perhaps it'll get really blurry, or make them really small so then maybe they'll load faster on a digital platform. So right now we're at 507 by 507 at 96 dpi, which means that this image is actually pretty small. So in general, it's pretty good practice to only size down your images and try to find an original source that is good quality. That being said, this is a demo, so we're just going to make the DVI over here 300, which is usually the quality that you want for print. So you can see when we adjust this, it automatically adjusts our width and our height, which means that this image has actually sized up significantly. 300 dpi or 300 ppi just basically means that for every square inch, physically, when you print it out, there will be 300 pixels there rather than 96 before, which means that it will be much higher quality with much more detail. That being said, of course, we went from a lower quality image to forcing it to be a higher quality image, which means that when we resize it up, it doesn't necessarily mean it's actually going to be like a better quality photo. It basically just means that there will be more squares of the same color. Even at a higher resolution, you can adjust the size of your image itself, so it can be a higher quality image but still smaller. In general, it's good to learn to resize your images just because it's best practice to have your images the right size for your file. When your photos are too big or too small, it usually results in really laggy files or extremely blurry printouts, so just make sure that you know how to do this. So next to image size, there's also canvas size, which is under images canvas size. This allows you to actually adjust the physical space or essentially the artboard of the image. So changing these values here will actually allow you to add space around your image or crop it in. It is basically your physical artboard that you're adjusting. You can also see here that it shows you the current size of the file, which is really handy when you need to resize images down. So for example, when you actually change the values of your width and height, you can see an updated size of the file. I'm just going to hit cancel just because I don't actually want these changes, but you would hit OK if you wanted those changes. So a habit that I've built up over the years is whenever I'm doing anything in Photoshop, I duplicate the layer that I'm working on before I make any changes. So I'm just going to right click here and hit duplicate layer. You can also hit Command J. And I just do this so then I have a backup in case I go too far and I decide I don't like my changes. Of course, if you already have the original file saved somewhere on your computer, then it probably isn't that big of a problem. I'm just going to hide the bottommost version of this, or the original, so then when we work, we won't be able to be bothered by the other one. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the pen tool, which, like Illustrator, shortcut is P, and we're going to do a really rough outline of our subject in place. You want to make sure that the layer that you want to mask is being selected right now. In general, when you're working on a Photoshop layer, you want to make sure that it's selected in your layers panel. So now that we've properly closed off our path, we can hit mask on the top left, which creates a mask. You can see in our layers panel, there is a mini version of our mask shown in gray and white. There are ways to adjust the way your mask presents. So here in this menu, there are a bunch of different options. If you change the way the mask presents, you're going to have to undo to before you hit the mask button, and then re-hit mask to see the changes. There are some options that are specifically for multiple masks on top of one layer, so some of them look like they don't do much here. So also with the pen tool, you can hit shape instead of mask, which gives you sort of like an Illustrator effect where you create a shape with the pen tool. So if you want the mask to actually cut the image, you can right click on the layer and hit rasterize vector mask. You can see that the background of the mask icon turns black. Then you can right click the mask again and hit apply layer mask. Now you can no longer adjust the points of the mask and have deleted the parts of the image the mask covered. So next up, I'm actually going to open up my Finder and bring in another photo. So I'm just going to drag and drop this into our file, and then I'm going to put the layer behind our original mask layer. And I'm just going to resize this image so then it fills up the entire room. You'll see that when I move this, Photoshop also gives you the same sort of guides that Illustrator does to help you move your image to the center points or to the edges of the board. Also, now you don't need to hold down Shift while you resize to have it resize proportionally. If you have a newer version of Photoshop, you won't need to do that. And if you hold down Shift, it'll actually resize unproportionally. So next we're just going to hit our check mark. And then if you take a look at the layer we just brought in, you might see that by the actual image, there's a little frame with a little square surrounding it. This means that the layer is a smart object. Smart objects are created when you bring in files that have a source saved on your computer. So you can double click on the smart object layer and it will open up in a separate tab. From here, you can edit the smart object however you like, and then when you save it, it will update in your previous file. So I'm just going to draw a random white line, hit save, and you can see that it appears in my other file in the background. The Smart Objects option is helpful when you're making complex compositions with many different layers. It's kind of like grouping your layers in Illustrator. We're going to be talking about blending modes next, which are a quick and easy way to make really cool changes to your image without really doing much. So first, I'm going to select our top layer. The blending modes are found here at the top of the layers panel. When you scroll over the different modes, you will get a preview of what the blending mode will look like. Basically, every blending mode changes the way the layers pixels will interact with the layers below. I'm just going to try and find one that isn't absolutely horrifying, and we'll just go with it. I wouldn't worry about memorizing what every blend mode specifically does, since you can scroll through them really fast, but these are really helpful when you're trying to make collages or imitate different kinds of lighting. I'm sure you will all use these plenty of times, so just try them out. But just as a tip, the blend mode only works on a layer if there is something below it, so make sure that if you are trying to put a blend mode on a layer that, there is an image behind it and it isn't the bottommost layer. So next we're going to return to our original document that we set up at 1920 by 1080. So here we're going to visit our layers panel again. This time at the bottom you will see a little half-filled circle. These are the adjustment layers. The most simple of these are probably like the brightness contrast or the levels, which just do basic edits to an image. You've probably heard of things like this already. So I'm just going to select levels here, and you'll see that it opens up a separate panel where I can adjust the levels of this layer. If you're struggling with figuring out how to edit the lighting in your photos, I think a pretty good general tip is to make sure the outer sliders in your levels touch the outside ends of your level curves. So basically, the outside arrows will point to the ends of the curves rather than, outside of them. You guys also should be taking a photo class, I think, next semester, so you'll learn more about photo editing then. So now when we go back to our layers panel, you will see that our adjustment layer has been added as a new layer. If we double click on it, it will bring us back to where we were editing our levels. The adjustment layer can be continued to be edited and isn't destructive to your original image. You can also find many of the same adjustment options by going to Image and then Adjustments. Here, there's also the level adjustments, but when you hit OK, the adjustment shows up attached to the layer that was originally selected and not as a separate adjustment layer. The adjustment layer affects everything that is below it, while going through the image and then going to adjustments, it only affects that layer. To show you this more clearly, I'm just going to copy and paste this image of the lamb from our other file and bring it in here. Currently, it is below our first adjustment layer, so the level changes we originally made are affecting it. However, the level changes specific to the shoe bill do not affect it. So here, I'm just adjusting the levels on the shoe bill layer, and you can see that the actual levels on the lamb layer are not changing. You can also make adjustment layers specific to a certain layer by creating a clipping mask. To showcase this, I'm first going to turn off this levels adjustment layer and create a new one for hue and saturation. I just think this might be a little bit more apparent for you guys to see, which is why I'm doing it. So I'm just going to make this all the way desaturated or black and white, so it's very apparent that, this adjustment layer is only affecting what's below it and not what's above it. So if I were to move the lamb layer below the adjustment layer, it also gets turned black and white. To make the adjustment layer specific to the lamb layer, we're going to right click and hit Create Clipping Mask. So we can see that the background layer has already returned to saturated, but I'm just going to turn this back to normal on the blending mode so it's a little bit more clear. But now you can see that it's black and white and only the lamb layer is affected by the adjustment layer. So again, you can also create a hue and saturation adjustment specific to one layer by going to the image adjustments and then hue and saturation. These are just different ways to basically get the same result. Again, I would recommend if you're trying to affect multiple layers to use the adjustment layers, and if you're just trying to affect one, using the image adjustment stuff works totally fine. So at the bottom of the layers panel next to the adjustment layers, there's a little rectangle with a circle in it which allows you to create a mask. Make sure you have the layer you want to create a mask on selected. So on our mask hue and saturation adjustment layer, I'm going to switch my color picker to black and use the brush tool. Wherever I paint over on our adjustment layer, it will mask or block the hue and saturation adjustments we made there. The reason why only the sheep turns back to color and not the bird behind it is because the adjustment layer is still clipping masked by the sheep layer. Painting with white can also be used as an eraser to repaint in the mask. You can get some really cool effects depending on what kind of brush you use and what kinds of things you do. So you can also select sort of like a softer brush, like this one, with the hardness turned down. And when you actually paint in, so I'm going to switch back to black, you get more of like a soft airbrush look, and the mask can sort of like fade in and out. You can do a lot of really cool effects with masks, so I would definitely recommend you get familiar with them. We're going to move on to some other cool editing tips in the next video, as well as discuss how to set up your files for print. I'll see you all in the next video.